And we're back again. I made it back safely.
We missed you last week, Tristan. We really did. We found a fill-in with with Jake. But there's no replacing you.
No replacing. Well, I appreciate that, but I had a great time in Philadelphia. Doing my thing, teaching people board games. That's always great. So, obviously I would have totally preferred to be here and not playing fun pieces of cardboard on a table. But yeah, so made it back safely. Seems like last week went pretty well. It looked like you guys had some pretty cool topics to talk about.
Yeah, a number of great, interesting things we were able to cover, and also with Jake's background from like the DeFi side of things, some really good insight to some of the different malware gangs that we were covering in the articles.
Nice.
We found ourselves a new potential for our short list of guess when you or myself are out of town.
Excellent. That's fantastic. We love to hear that. But that was last week. This is this week. It is December 8th, and we are doing GPS Live. Thank you so much for joining us for another kind of weekend review of the news as Jonathan and I go through it. If you're joining us live, thank you so much. Go ahead and let us know in the comments where you're coming in from. And join the conversation with us. Let us know your thoughts. We can see those coming in live, and we love to pull those into the conversation that we're having. But if you're joining us on demand, if you're watching this after the fact, thank you so much for giving us some of your time. And we can obviously also still see your comments after the fact. So if you see something, you think we missed something, let us know. We can circle back to those conversations week by week. But before we get started, there is something that we do have to take care of. Which is the fact that the views and opinions expressed by Jonathan and myself are our own. They do not necessarily reflect the views of GuidePoint Security. We are graciously given this platform to discuss these things, but we're not always right about everything we say. So it's a live discussion. I think the great thing that I love about this is that sometimes we're just literally formulating opinions on these things as we talk about it and realize things.
Sometimes we make it up as we go, and it looks good enough too.
And sometimes that's good enough. But yeah, I think we've got some really interesting stories this week. Some cool stuff that you found from Dark Reading and Security Week and other places. So let's dive in with our first one, which you had some interesting, I think, kind of technical insights on. But this one's cool. So what's up, Jonathan?
Yeah. So beware, everybody. Your cell phones, your laptops, all of your devices are vulnerable. It's that time of the year. But no, coming to us, like you said, from Dark Reading, we have an interesting article regarding a new Bluetooth flaw. And many of you may already be familiar with what Bluetooth is, right? It's kind of that way that we use.
You may be familiar with what Bluetooth is.
Because
wild statement for a cybersecurity show.
It kind of kicks into like how this vulnerability works in the sense, right? And,
yeah.
And so, our host devices, phones, laptops, things of that nature, are going to allow these client devices like keyboards and mice and Bluetooth headsets and all kinds of things, your AirPods, whatever they are, to connect and interact for some very basic or simple purpose. Well, a particular researcher has discovered a number of flaws that affect a variety of systems. We're talking stuff from Android, iOS, and Linux, all kind of being targeted here. So, so what's the Bluetooth vulnerability, Tristan?
Yeah, so what this is actually doing, and it's unique, I think, when you have a vulnerability like this that kind of affects like across the spectrum, right? Android and iOS is very often not paired together as far as vulnerabilities go, because they're very different systems and they're built differently from a security perspective. But with this particular Bluetooth vulnerability, it allows an attacker to attach an emulated Bluetooth keyboard without authenticating with the device. So the normal flow, if you're, using, I actually kind of like remember when this change was implemented, when I suddenly saw like the request being authenticated as a universal thing on devices. But when you go to pair Bluetooth keyboard, it should usually prompt you to like throw a code on the screen to say, hey, type this in on the keyboard. And then we'll know that it's authenticated. And you can only do that if you're looking at the device and you got it in front of you. This allows an attacker to just completely, without authentication, pair a Bluetooth keyboard to the device, which then allows them to take control of it. They have access to do anything using those keystrokes. All of these systems essentially, like phones are just streamlined computers, right? So there's still access to be able to type in commands without actually having to touch the screen or launch anything. So that's a pretty deep flaw and critical vulnerability. But importantly, one of the things that is noted here is that they're emulating that Bluetooth keyboard legitimately attached to the target. But if your device is locked, that does, like your phone, your iPhone or your Android phone is locked and requires authentication just to like start operating at all, they can't do anything while they're while it's under those circumstances, right? But once you unlock that device, basically free and clear. I'm sure you would probably notice some stuff happening on your screen though.
So this is very similar to a vulnerability that came out a number of years ago where about 17 different keyboard manufacturers were using a common wireless dongle, right? This wasn't necessarily Bluetooth itself, but the fact that they were using a dongle that was universally kind of accepted across a number of manufacturers. And so you just had to kind of show up with one of those different keyboards and you could then type on somebody's computer. This is absolutely attacking the Bluetooth stack. And as you mentioned, we're talking tricking the host by pairing with a fake keyboard without user confirmation.
Right.
Is absolutely going to do some terrible things. Now, it affects each type of system differently.
Right.
So for those that are with an Android, it just affects you all the time when it's unlocked.
Yeah.
When you are with Linux, you have to have Bluetooth in discovery mode. So at least you have to, like, it can be on, but you also have to say like, and discoverable. And then from an iOS and Mac OS, so we're talking both phones and laptops here, that has to include one final step, which is you have to be using one of those Apple Magic keyboards. That's that prerequisite. Although it's also kind of not uncommon because the Mac keyboard is a little bit different than a Windows keyboard. So you usually find yourself buying a Mac keyboard anyways when you kind of dock at your desk. And so it's been around for some time. It affects a number of different systems, right?
Yeah, so this particular flaw has been present for over 10 years. The first instance of it was discovered in Android 4.2, I believe it was, which is back from 2012. It is
Android.
Yeah, that is reaching far back. I mean, my first Android phone was the Motorola Droid, and that would have been in 2009, I think.
Okay.
And that was like that's the early days. I think Android 4 was one of the first like fully mass kind of public, like this is a polished OS now. But yeah, it reaches all the way back to 2012 with 4.2. But it's important to note that this has been patched. Like in Linux, this particular flaw was patched in 2020. But unfortunately, the fix was left disabled by default. So the fix exists. It just wasn't actually being utilized unless you went in to dig and find it. But with Android in particular, it affects devices that are running Android 10 and earlier. So from 4.2 up to Android 10 are impacted by this. And the Android 10 was the operating system for the Pixel 4. We're now on the Pixel 8. So we're looking at least 4 or 5 years back with that. But I think the important thing to note about this is that there was this real surge of cheap and readily available kind of like IoT devices and like small, single purpose devices that ran Android because it was a free
refrigerators
and refrigerators and yeah, everything like that, right? That probably are not have not been upgraded. So if you're working with tech in your environment or any kind of devices in your environment that were running Android as the baseline operating system, and you haven't swapped those out or looked at them in 4 years, you need to check if those have been updated and upgraded because someone could just take over if they have any kind of Bluetooth functionality.
So from the Mac perspective, there's one caveat. I did mention the keyboard thing, but from the other side of it, it does actively bypass Apple's security protections. And those are in what's called lockdown mode. That's an extra feature that was kind of developed for protecting devices for sophisticated cyber attacks. This still goes beyond that. And so we're looking towards after the new year. The developer has stated that in January, a proof of concept will be released for Linux. And I don't imagine it being long after where other developers will start to find ways of manipulating that for different platforms.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm really positive that those of you that play with your flippers are going to be doing this to all of the devices in the proximity, because you're already doing it with fake beats on everybody's phones.
Also, if since Jonathan has pulled out his slipper, if any of our wonderful viewers would love to buy me a Christmas present, I will give you my PO box. And you can send me a flipper. And I actually misspoke a little bit earlier. I wanted to clarify. This currently still affects Android devices from 10 and previous. There has been no patch released. Versions after Android 10 were still vulnerable to this particular flaw. But they have released a security update already to patch that out of those devices. It's just that Android 10 and previous, I believe, is just no longer supported through OS development at all. So I just wanted to make that clear. You still do have to apply a security update to your Android phone if you want to make sure this doesn't happen to you.
So be on the lookout for updates affecting people that are running like Ubuntu LTS 20, people that are running any Android phone. It does call out the Pixel 7 here running 14.
Yeah.
And as far as MacBooks go, it's been seen to be affected by both M1, M2, and Intel-based systems. So we're all here, except for the lovely PC people.
The PC... that one shocks me a little bit. You would think that this would be something that would crop up there, but
I'm going to say something about Unix, Linux, subsystem, blah blah blah, and mildly related.
I think though that the key takeaway here is this is really just like an object lesson in hey, like every device that you have is running an operating system, whether it be just running a stripped down version of Linux, or it's running Android, or it's running something else. And if you're not staying on top of those to make sure, excuse me, there's something in my throat really.
If you're not
staying on top of that to make sure that you're keeping on top of patches, you're keeping on top of security updates, something as simple as just hey, Bluetooth was never disabled on this thing or something like that can leave you vulnerable. And even if the device doesn't have a screen, right? Because this is not something that's giving an attacker access to see what is happening on the device. They're executing all this remotely. But because it's an emulated Bluetooth keyboard, if I know which device that I'm going after and I can just look up the series of prompts, I can just, pre-program my keystrokes and the weight that I need in between each one of them, right? And just hit enter and it'll just run the entire thing. I never need to look at it.
Oh yeah.
So very important to stay on top of that, especially in an organizational environment where you've got devices coming in and out all the time. People are buying tech all the time and adding it to the network. Make sure that you're staying on top of that.
I feel like there's a missed opportunity to call this a blue ducky.
Blue ducky. But we've gone a little long on this one. We've already taken 15 minutes here, so let's jump to the next one. This is this one you also had some technical insight on, and I know less about this. But Five Eyes agencies have published new guidance on eliminating memory safety bugs. This is coming to us from Security Week. Now, I used to work in intelligence, right? That was my job in the Marine Corps, so I was very familiar with Five Eyes and their guidance on various topics. And this one comes specifically about the fact that a lot of the languages that we use to code and program all of our platforms and our devices and things are vulnerable to these memory safety bugs. So they're trying to get ahead of that and recommend some baseline standards for how we should be operating. Looks like my video froze, so I'm going to take care of that.
Okay, well, let's all do it together. The Five Eyes are the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and but back to the memory bugs, right? And so if anybody has been a developer for any period of time now, stuff like C, C++, what was going on is you may have learned how to program, and you have things like gets and puts, or get string, put string. But what's happening is a lot of the functionality of some of these older low level or ish programming languages are terrible at memory management. And
Yeah.
memory management is going to be the bane of every existence when it comes to bugs in standard applications that are ran in Linux and Windows environments. In fact, one of the most common types of memory bugs is called a buffer overflow. And so many of our viewers may have heard of this term before. And so what's happening is Five Eyes is coming out and saying, look, we really need to figure out how to show people to use maybe better programming languages, more modern languages that address how to handle memory bugs, unlike legacy C, C++, and be able to make more secure programming opportunities without having to go back and consider all of those things. Some of the other types of memory bugs out there, right, like ASLR, that address space layout randomization, that also was, kind of bypassing ASLR protections was something very common in a lot of bugs targeting Windows applications.
Right.
I could go on for a while. There's NX bits and all kinds of things. But the point is programs that were written a long time ago or using legacy languages are riddled or potentially riddled with memory attacks against it, and stepping out of a program's lane into some other space of memory and then being able to launch your code. I mean, this is like Metasploit plus NOP sled all over again. But it's good to see some advisement, right, coming from these agencies to help different countries, different governments, different development companies take a step up. And that's my soapbox, though. I think memory bugs are awesome because that is how we get a lot of our modern security researchers employed these days. Again, our opinions are our own.
They are our own. Like you said, it's good to see this guidance coming up. But I think a key factor in this, right, is that the guidance calls out, quote, eliminating this vulnerability class should be seen as a business imperative, likely requiring participation from many departments, and end quote. It urges, directors and executives to get involved in this. But the key, I think, driver here is that there's a lot of technical debt on this side, right? We're looking at decades and decades of poorly programmed or badly implemented software and code that leaves us open to these things. And so for decades now, organizations, whether they are the developers or they are the end customers, have been implementing like this patchwork of band-aids on top of this, right? So when you look at this, you've got SOCs and defenders and everything trying to implement stuff like marking certain sections of memory as non-executable, and like you said, ASLR, right? And sandboxing, like trying to get all of these mitigation techniques to keep memory bugs from impacting the organization, and so frequently they already do. And what the guidance is really driving at is that, hey, if we can make the transition to using memory safe language for our programming, if we can start training our developers, making them smarter, using these new, more secure languages, it's going to free up so much resource for both the developers and the implementers, the end customers, because the end customers will no longer have to be worried about maintaining 16 different security tools and implementations just to prevent memory bugs from affecting them. And then developers will no longer have to be worried, I don't want to say no longer have to be worried, but be less worried about having to constantly patch and update and fix small things. And we changed this line of code because it led to a memory bug, but that broke that 8 lines of code back, right? Like, they'll be able to focus on other things. So if we can start from a baseline of security, which is really what this is urging, right? Let's start thinking about this from a baseline of security. Stop going with the cheapest solution, the solution that everyone already knows, or the code that everyone already knows. Start training for memory safe languages. Start using that as your baseline, and then use good development principles and practices, DevSec, from the beginning. And then it's one of those things that we need to make the investment now, and we're not going to see the payoff for several years, right? Until all of these things are implemented, these new tools are in place. But once that happens, it's going to free up the resource.
Now, one thing we do want to make known, though, is doesn't mean you got to just completely drop your care for security just because you're using maybe a more modern language, right? They still want to make sure that you're using mitigation methods to reduce this at large. using stuff like secure coding guidelines, fuzzing, and finally things like static testing or SAST and dynamic testing, DAS, which our developer viewers may be familiar with some of those terms. So still do good security, but we can, as you said, graduate past an entire generation of languages that allow these types of bugs to exist by using something a little bit safer.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of that's honestly, we haven't done a lot of, at least I haven't been here. You might have done some last week, but I feel like we've been missing out on some of the more forward and like positive stories. Recently, like there was a large glut of some stuff that was just all bad news. But this week, I think we've got a pretty solid docket of good news, like Five Eyes agencies coming together and agreeing on some guidelines and urging that. But that brings us to our next story, which is Health and Human Services and their new guidance and guidelines. Which is one that, because I'd like to save our last one because that's the best story. I'd like to save our fourth story for the last. So let's jump into the HHS, the Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, publishing a roadmap of new strategy for cybersecurity in the healthcare sector. And you made a comparison right before we started recording. You said this was like something else. So refresh me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is kind of putting together a bunch of numbers. And for instance, one of their statistics is that there's been a 93% increase in large data breaches in healthcare alone in the past 4 years, right? And we're seeing increases in ransomware attacks against hospitals. We're seeing increase in all kinds of different challenges, especially in the medical field. And so Health and Human Services is looking at a number of different goals as part of this next generation built on the current administration's national cybersecurity strategy. And one of those is going to be establishing some kinds of voluntary performance goals. But one of the ones, before I even kind of get into the detail, that I found was that we're going to have an update to HIPAA's security rule.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
Yeah, HIPAA's kind of been around for a while as the standard, right? And for those that play along at home, the Health Insurance Probability and Accountability Act has a section, security rule section, and we're going to see an update in spring of 2024. And so we're really starting to say, healthcare, you're probably working on maybe some older standards. Let's look at giving you something new and refreshed.
Right. Specifically, one of the things that is laid out in here, investment-based incentives program to encourage hospitals to invest in their cybersecurity infrastructure. Like you mentioned, right, this is establishing a voluntary cybersecurity performance goals. So it's up to the individual organizations whether they want to do this or not. This is a mandate, but the approach that they're looking at is actually incentivizing that and saying, hey, if you're investing in your cybersecurity, if you're upgrading these systems, if you are taking these steps, we are going to reinvest back into you. So some form of enticement there. And like you mentioned, though, updating HIPAA in 2024 and bringing that in, specifically what they call out is the Department of Health and Human Services is planning to work with Congress to increase the amounts of civil monetary penalties.
There you go.
So we have some incentive and we have some correction.
Sticks.
Yeah, we've got the carrot, we've got the stick, we have them both. But not only increasing the monetary penalties for a HIPAA violation related to cybersecurity, but also expanding HHS's investigative capabilities in that area. So giving them more remit to look into these incidents and make determinations about when to apply these kinds of fines. So this is going to be an interesting thing to watch that be implemented over time, right? A voluntary framework that has some strong incentive to actually start implementing and moving towards, and also has probably I'm going to guess these increased penalties are probably going to hurt if you violate them, right? Oh, yeah. If they're taking this as seriously as it should be taken. So it'll be interesting to see once 2024 hits, right? I remember my dad used to the small business that my dad owned when I was growing up. fell under HIPAA. And I remember there was a change to HIPAA one year, and it meant like an entire office upgrade for my dad. Like he had to like build new walls in his office. And that was just for like physical security kind of stuff, right? So with cybersecurity, it'll be interesting to see how healthcare organizations adapt to these new guidelines.
No, I'm excited for that. A couple other little things, right? Is healthcare systems, they want to encourage them to take steps to identify and address cybersecurity vulnerabilities along the way.
Yeah,
I would hope proactively, right? And regularly review risks and records and update their policies. So all good things in my book.
yeah.
But with
All
that,
great.
we can go ahead and round off for our last story of the day. I joked before the show that we're going to talk about your friend here. But no, it's not Tristan's friend. This is Tristan's enemy.
Yeah,
He is a
these are
very, very bad person, according to this article. But it's good news for everybody. A topic that we've covered here multiple times on the show, the Trickbot malware developer is guilty in court, or at least has pled guilty in court.
Yeah, I was going to say he's pled guilty to the charges. Has not been found guilty, but a guilty plea is probably going to lead to being found guilty, I would imagine. It's pretty hard to overcome that. But according to some court documents, the 40-year-old developer, Russian developer, known as FFX, has pled guilty, but he specifically oversaw the development of Trickbot's browser injection component as a malware developer. So he was responsible for a pretty fundamental part of the Trickbot malware system. And Dunayev, I believe, is the way that his name's pronounced. First started working Dunayev. I'm not a fluent Russian speaker. If someone wants to jump in the comments and give me a phonetic breakdown on it. But started working with Trickbot in June of 2016. And then was arrested in South Korea in 2021. Interestingly, the reason that we caught him, at least I think it's kind of interesting, is that the reason that he was caught is because COVID restrictions. He was in South Korea and then got stuck there for over a year due to the fact that there were so many travel restrictions around COVID-19, and he had an expired passport. So he couldn't get to his couldn't get a new passport. He couldn't get out of the country. And then because of that, he was there long enough for the extradition process to complete. And he was extradited on October 20th, 2021. So we've been waiting a bit. I mean, this is 2 years now for this trial to take place. He's been in custody and has now pled guilty.
Now, if the name Trickbot sounds familiar, not just from this show, but from other stories, one of the key details is that the Trickbot malware was fairly nefarious, and where it helped its operators harvest a number of different personal and sensitive information bits from computers, including stuff like credentials, credit cards, emails, passwords, dates of birth, social security numbers, and addresses, and even go as far as stealing funds from their victims' bank accounts with this information. So the malicious software being there basically harvested everything it could get its hands on, sends it back to the baddies, and then they start beginning their financial crimes, including draining your accounts. Now, this particular individual who has pled guilty isn't alone in this world, right? His co-defendants did hide behind their computers, unlike him getting caught in person. And there are other parties that are, being sought after that were used or that did use Trickbot to infect millions of computers worldwide. This is a massive kind of, piece of malware being targeted here. It was used against hospitals, schools, and businesses, among other things. So.
And Trickbot was eventually taken over by Conti, the ransomware gang, and used as a baseline to develop much more insidious, I think, pieces of code, I would say, and to develop more. And so just this year, the United States and the UK sanctioned 18 individuals in association with Trickbot and with Conti. And so this is just one of those, one of the kind of end results of that work that the US and the UK have been doing to try and apprehend these criminals. They also draw attention in this article on Bleeping Computer to the fact this is the second Trickbot gang member that's been arrested by the U.S. Department of Justice. In 2021, in February, they arrested a Latvian man who goes by Max, and he was charged with helping to write the code used to control and deploy ransomware on victims' networks.
Crime doesn't pay.
Crime doesn't pay. This is a win for everyone, and it's good to see something that we talked about very early on in the early days of GPS Live, right? The surge in cybersecurity guidance and programs that were being set forth by the federal government to try and crack down on cybercrime. It's all coming back around, right? These are the results of these international agreements and cooperations that have been put in place to try and take down these cybercrime gangs. But that brings us to the end of our show. We are 1 minute over. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Jonathan for gathering stories this week. I've been catching up on work, so
the news finder of the week.
The news finder of the week. Get gold plaque. We need to like Photoshop a little gold plaque onto your employee of the week. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, for GPS Live for the week of December 8th. We hope that we will see you again next week. We're coming up on the holidays, so we're probably also going to have some time off around that, and we will keep you guys abreast of that schedule if anything changes. But until then, I have been and will continue to be Tristan Morris.
And I am Jonathan Singer.
And we will see you all next time.